Continuing discussions of Heter HaMechira. In order for there to be a transaction, a sale, there has to be Gmiras Daas between the Mocher and the Kona, between the buyer and the seller. They have to have a meeting of the minds. And the Gemara discusses a case where someone comes, brigands, and they hang a guy up on a tree and they are forcing him to sign over some property. Now, there is a difference. If they pay him for the property, he didn't want to sell, but they force him to sell it, he receives a reasonable price, maybe not full market value, but a reasonable price for the land. Then we say, even though they forced him into it, there is a Gmiras Daas, there is a agreement to sell because he's getting money for it. However, if they force him to sign it away without paying him anything, then everyone knows that he never wanted to sell it. And so there's no sale at all. So the Gmiras Daas required of a seller isn't complete. It's of a level that he's aware of what's going on and in some way he accepts it. Now, it's clearly true in terms of farmers selling their land that they want to keep their land. But for different reasons, they're getting rid of it for a period of time. We have extensive discussions by Mechirah's chametz, where someone that owns a distillery, for instance, he doesn't want to sell the distillery. This is how he makes his business. Even if someone would offer him full value for the distillery, he wouldn't want to sell it. So he's making a sale to avoid religious problems. And there is a level of Gmiras Daas here, of an agreement of mind, even if there is not a complete agreement of mind. And that's considered good enough for the sale to go through. So too, Rav Kook has said, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach has said in different places, that when someone sells their land for Shmita, there is a level of Gmiras Daas that is high enough that it is, in fact, a valid sale for these issues. These are the classic issues that have been raised in terms of the Heter HaMechira. There's something else. Rav Kook asks an obvious question. If in the times of the Talmud it was possible to sell the land and thereby avoid the issues of Shmita, why would they have told people to go sow your fields during the Shmita so that you can pay the tax? They should have said, listen, let's sell the fields and then you can sow it and it will be a lesser level of prohibition. But they never tried to do that. So he says, in the times of the Gemara, when the majority of land in Eretz Yisrael was Jewish owned, then there was a decree on not using non-Jewish produce of Eretz Yisrael on the Shemitah year as well. And because of this, selling our land wouldn't have obviated the issues. And Rav Kook says, right now, in his time this was true, only a very small amount of the land in Eretz Yisrael is owned and controlled by Jews. However, he says, when this changes, we will have to revisit this issue. There's another reason that Rav Kook gives, and that is what we call in modern Hebrew Rabanut al, the greater ownership. The fact that taxes had to be paid to a non-Jewish authority in the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, to the Romans, the Greeks, this meant that ultimately they owned the land and not the Jewish, quote, owner. Because in fact, if the Jew didn't pay the tax, the non-Jewish authority would come and take away the land. So the obligation to pay the tax means that there is a kind of ownership of the land of the governmental authority. Now, if this is true in the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, that the governmental authority ownership of the land reduced the level of Shmita obligation because there was a kind of non-Jewish ownership on it, then Rav Goren, for both of these issues that Rav Kook raised long before they were relevant, Rav Goren said that we have a problem. Because if we revisit the issue, now the majority of people that are farming in Eretz Yisrael are Jewish farmers. And therefore, we should go back and have the original limitations, the original Gezeres Chazal, of if there is majority ownership of the land in Eretz Yisrael, then the prohibitions on non-Jewish produce should also apply during the Shmita year. This would obviate one of the great heterim that some people use of buying non-Jewish produce during Shmita. Because if, as Rav Kook argues, and as Rav Goren revives the issue, that majority ownership of the land creates an obligation even where one didn't, creates an obligation of observing the Shmita with non-Jewish produce, even though previously, for millennia, the land was controlled, the majority of land was owned by non-Jews, and so there was no Shmita, and Rav Kook argued, and therefore there's even a lesser obligation on Jewish-owned land, and this situation is true. In any case, the two of these coming together led Rav Goren to rethink the issue of Heter HaMechira. He still came down on the side that we have to do it, but he says these raise greater questions as to the Heter HaMechira in our time versus in pre-state times. And again, I've talked about this at the very beginning. When one is choosing the ideal source to buy fruit for Shmita, that's one thing. And ideally, one should eat fruit that has the Kedusha of Shmita, as several Achronim say, that we discussed earlier, that if if the land, the air of the land of Israel makes one wise, also the more so would the fruit of the Shmita year make one wise. Now, so one should try and get things with the sanctity of Shmita in a mutter way. But if Rav Kook is correct, then this would apply even to non-Jewish produce grown, at least by rabbinic decree, when the majority of the land near Israel is under Jewish control. It could be, since Israel has not formally annexed most of the occupied territories, that things grown there would have a different halacha vis-a-vis Rabanut al, and you're also talking about the fact that the majority of the land in those areas is in fact owned and controlled by non-Jews. But these are interesting modern day considerations of the Shmita. Everything else that we've talked about was raised at the latest in the 1920s, 100 years ago, and Rav Goren's issues are raised 40 years ago, very much 40, 50 years ago, much more in our lifetimes than the other issues that we've talked about. And this is a new consideration. It still seems to me that in terms of the entire state, it would be impossible for us to keep Shmita without some type of Heter HaMechira for the entire people. And often when these are the only things available, that's what one should buy. I would also like to note at this point that Rav Yosef said many, many times that for people for whom fruits and vegetables are expensive, it's prohibited not to rely on the heter, which is the most inexpensive way of getting fruits and vegetables during the Shmita year. He said, especially for Avrechim and Kolel, people learning in Kollel whose money is very limited, that they should be using the Heter, as he says, Sephardi Rabbanim have been using in Eretz Yisrael for 400 years. Next time we will still be discussing the Heter Mechira, but once the land is sold, can Jews do everything, or is there still a limitation on what Jews can do with the land and on the land and so on? And everyone should have a wonderful day.